Pre-psychedelics, existential responsibility was an intellectual understanding. After my first psychedelic experience, existential responsibility became an emotional, and if you want to use the word spiritual, beyond cognitive processing and beyond thinking, but you know it's you because it's the core you.
You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
Today, Alex and I have with us Dr. Richard Lewis Miller, who has come back to our podcast for the second time. Really, really grateful for you to come back for us, Dr. Miller, to answer some of the questions that we didn't have a chance to cover last time. I thought we'd continue where we left off, really, on the last podcast. We went through LSD, MDMA, and magic mushrooms in the last podcast, and that brings us on to the next psychedelic that you've spoken about in your book, which is ayahuasca. So I've heard you speak a little bit about ayahuasca. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
You are pronouncing it correctly, ayahuasca.
And I was interested, actually, because from what I've heard from your experiences, actually, they weren't the most positive experiences. Is that correct?
Well, they weren't negative.
Mm-hmm.
They were large experiences of the magnitude of an LSD experience in the range above 250 micrograms.
Okay.
So, anywhere from 250 on up to 500 or 600. So it's a very large experience when you take a full dose. That said, people are now experimenting with smaller doses of ayahuasca, and they're even attempting to create a microdose of ayahuasca.
Okay.
So we're going to learn more of it, as the future unfolds. But presently, people take a standard dose, and that gives them an experience that lasts anywhere between 8 and 12 hours. So it's a large experience, as I said, like the serious LSD experience of 250 micrograms plus. Well, you indicated that commented that I wasn't too, excited about it, and that's true. And the reason for that is, and it might just be me because I'm hearing lots of positive reports from people in certain circumstances, but I found the experience to be very large, but not one that I could have significant enough takeaways to make the length of time and what it put my system through worthwhile in terms of a cost-benefit analysis and a risk-reward ratio, which is pretty much how I operate. And so, given that the takeaways, the bringing back, I mean, one of the critical issues with all psychedelics, from my perspective, is how much information, both cognitive and experiential, can we bring back from the experience and make use of in our daily lives? Because if we are unable to do that, then it's sort of a ride at the circus. It might be a fun ride, but, you don't usually go to the circus and hang out for 8 hours on the same ride or 10 hours. If you could take that ride for 20 minutes, like DMT, well, then you might say, okay, dimethyltryptamine, you take it, it's a 15-minute trip, 20 minutes. It's hard to bring anything back because it happens so fast, but it's such a glorious experience that you might want to do it once in a while. But be advised that you're more doing that for recreational purposes than for medicinal purposes. So not to knock recreation, but that's a different area of specialty than mine. I mean, I'm all for recreation, but my interest in psychedelics is primarily as medicinals. So ayahuasca is similar to it actually is in a very way, chemically as well, similar to a DMT experience. It's huge, but how much can you bring back? Now, you may find people who will tell you they brought back stuff, and they brought back remarkable stuff, and I say more power to them. There's another caveat with ayahuasca that is concerning to me, that we do not have with LSD, and we have in a different way with MDMA, and I'll mention that and discuss it with you. And the caveat is, we don't have tourist LSD experiences going on. We don't have people flying to exotic jungles, crawling their way through, staying at unusual places, and paying huge amounts of money in order to take LSD, right? LSD is an equal opportunity employer. It's relatively cheap. You can get it good, very clean, relatively easily. And then if you follow the proper protocols and get yourself a good guide, that you can get, you're safe. But what's come out of ayahuasca is this whole tourist industry where people are flying to the Amazon, they're flying to places, and there are so-called shaman down there, and there are retreat centers that are building up. And
are they taking advantage, do you think?
I think some of them must be terrific people who are offering a wonderful service. I think some of them must be bogus. Some of them are not really shaman. Some of them are just total fakes. And some of them must be wonderful.
How much are people paying for these experiences?
Oh, I think they're paying thousands of dollars for a weekend. Okay. And maybe an on up. I just heard of one place that's catering to the jet set only, that kind of thing. And, hopefully they'll have some good people working there in addition to the high price. But this opens up, it opens up a specter of uncertainty. And that's not a good thing for the average person. That's not a good thing for the public. You don't want to go for a medicine and have to worry about whether the doctor's a fake or whether the material is adulterated, right? You want to know you're getting the best possible material and you're getting a great doctor. So we have these issues with ayahuasca. And then the other issue is, as contrasted with LSD, which is a one-on-one, the guide and one person, or possibly a one-on-two, the guide and a couple. And the same with MDMA as a medicinal, one-on-one, and the same with psilocybin, one-on-one. Ayahuasca is done in circles, groups of people. And I think there is a future, a big future, in group therapy with psychedelics. But we're not there yet. I mean, we're just, the field is just opening up in terms of LSD is still illegal around the world, right? I mean, we're just scratching the surface. And research is still being suppressed around the world, or very difficult to do with LSD. So we've got a lot more we have to do before we get to a sophisticated modality such as group therapy. I do think it has a lot of promise. It does have a lot of promise. And also group therapy, I'm a group therapy specialist with families and with individuals, and I have a great deal of experience. And I love doing group therapy, and I love the fact that it's less expensive. It's so much less expensive because you got 15 people chipping in on your fee rather than one. So that is wonderful. And it means one therapist can see hundreds of people rather than a handful of people. So that's all good. But we're not there yet. And I have questions about one group leader leading 15 or 20 or 25 people who are all under the influence of a very powerful psychedelic. I've got questions. And now I think the good ones who are responsible, they have assistants. Their assistants are trained and they supervise them. And I think we've got a pretty good situation, and they're doing some groundbreaking work on group therapy and ayahuasca. But at the same time, I think there are those who are doing it, who are just doing it to make a buck. They don't really have any experience in group therapy. They don't have any credentials in psychology or medicine. And, they've taken a couple of trips and et cetera, and they opened up a business because they're fabulous at marketing. So we've got this to watch out for, but that's how life is, particularly with new products.
Well, you mentioned risks, and I've read in your book that there are deaths related to ayahuasca. What other risks are there related to taking it?
Well, I can tell you that in my book, Psychedelic Medicine, I interviewed the planet's foremost LSD researcher, Dr. Dave Nichols, formerly of Indiana University. He says, in my interview, published, there has not been a recorded death from LSD. That's not true with ayahuasca. We have reports of deaths in the jungle from ayahuasca. Statistically, are they relevant? It doesn't appear so. It's not like what we've had with cocaine and heroin, where there's reports of emergency room visits from all over the country, if not all over the world, when we go through one of our famous every 20 or 30 year cocaine epidemics. And the same with heroin. We know we have people dying, not from heroin. They're dying from the stuff that's mixed in with the heroin, such as fentanyl. Heroin itself is not particularly dangerous if it's used properly.
If it's used properly.
If it's the key word is used properly.
Yeah.
And the all-time N of one famous case of that is William Burroughs. Probably the world's most famous heroin addict, and who lived to beyond 80, I believe. But again, heroin in a way is in the same ballpark maybe with alcohol, which is you can drink quite a bit of alcohol as long as you make sure to eat properly and exercise and take care of yourself. But alcohol is toxic. Even if you do exercise and eat carefully, it's still a toxic substance. Whereas heroin in and of itself is not a toxic substance. Mm-hmm. But you can get by with alcohol. I mean, it depends on how much you drink, if you take care of the other issues. What happens too often with alcoholics, of course, is that they neglect their nutrition. They certainly neglect exercise. And so their immune systems, go, and then the toxicity of the alcohol has the greatest chance of having a negative effect on their overall system. By the way, I mention alcohol because historically, it has been the world's most popular, perhaps, psychoactive material, maybe second to coffee and tea. Coffee and tea might come in first. I'm not sure of that in terms of worldwide consumption.
Coffee is definitely number one for me.
Number one? Well, be careful of it. Depends on how much you drink every day. You really want to monitor that. But when I did my internationally renowned, if I may say, Koch Enders Alcohol and Drug Program treating chemically dependent people, one of the most severe withdrawals of 1,500 people in the sample, my N, 1,500, was coffee withdrawal. Two psychologists who came to me from the Midwest, and it turned out when we did a depth interview that their secretary was giving them coffee every hour on the hour in between patients. So by the end of the day, they had drank about 8 or 9 cups of coffee, and they were suffering from severe depression as well as major withdrawal when they came off it. The second largest withdrawal symptoms came from a person who was drinking 3 to 4 6-packs of Coca-Cola every day with caffeine in it. And that person also had a terrible withdrawal. Terrible meaning huge headaches and muscular cramps. The headaches were really, really very severe.
Another drug, for want of a better word, that I wanted to speak to you about is something that you don't speak about in your book, but I know that you discuss a lot on your radio program, and that's cannabis. As a trainee psychiatrist, I've seen a lot of the negative effects of cannabis. I was wondering, what's your experience with cannabis? Do you use it, and would you advise it in terms of using in therapy or?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the late 60s, I did some experiments with in a training group. I had 12 doctors who were in a training group, and I was training them with my partner, Dr. Larry Bloomberg, in how to do classic Gestalt therapy. as formulated by Fritz Perls, who was our teacher. And so we did some experiments with the doctors, having them smoke marijuana before group therapy sessions. And we did a series of these and recorded them, and then, looked over the data. And we decided that it was a, you might call it a pilot project, and it wasn't a huge study. We had 12 people, but they were, a good variety and a good sample. And we concluded that marijuana was not a medicine amenable for use in group therapy. And we sort of extended that to individual and couples therapy as well. And the reason for it was the marijuana led to a wide variety of emotional reactions and cognitive thoughts. And they were intrusive depending on how much marijuana you took. Now, it's related to THC level, of course. All medicine is dose related. But when they smoked enough to feel it and feel it, fairly strongly, they manifested what we call, and you all must call also over there across the pond, inappropriate affect. In other words, one person could be talking about his mother dying, and somebody across the room could be laughing because there was something funny about the way he used a word in a sentence. And we attributed that, and we saw that happening often, where there wasn't consistency of focus. There wasn't empathetic consistency of focus. For group therapy to work, you need to create an esprit de corps where there's focus on the person who's talking and emoting, so that everybody is empathetic and lined up emotionally and cognitively with that person. Mm-hmm. But when you have one person working on something deep, like the death of a mother, and the other person across the room is laughing their head off, that is not appropriate for group therapy. And I'm using that as one dramatic example. We had many examples of it. So that was a turnoff in terms of marijuana in group and individual therapy for us. And we've let it go as that. But that's not the end of the story, because marijuana does have many medicinal effects, and we are going to be learning a great deal more now that research is going to be more and more allowed, because so many states in the United States have passed laws allowing either medicinal and or recreational marijuana. So what do we know about it historically? Before marijuana was made illegal in the United States, it was sold for lockjaw and menstrual cramps. Why? Because marijuana is a muscle relaxant. And it can be, if you ingest or smoke enough of it, it can be a very strong muscle relaxant. In fact, it can be so strong that you don't want to do anything but relax, like sit in a chair or lay down in a bed. And that's why it's often referred to colloquially as dope. Mm-hmm. It's not referred to as smart, because you can feel sort of dopey. And the reason you do is because of the major muscle relaxant effects. It's quite simple. When your muscles are feeling tremendously loose, it doesn't lend itself to using the muscles to keep the skeletal system upright, which is what their job is, right? It lends itself to sitting back and really major relaxing. So does it have potential in the muscle relaxant areas? Definitely. Does it have potential in creativity in the mind? I believe it does, and I think we're going to find out more about its use in creative and problem solving, because it does loosen up things in the nervous system and allow for looking at the world in different ways. Mm-hmm. The other thing about marijuana that I think it lends itself to having a lot of positive potential once we really get more research done is that it's relatively harmless. It's when you compare it to alcohol, it's like the difference between heaven and hell. I mean, you guys over there published this magnificent article a few years ago in Lancet on alcohol. You know the study I'm talking about? Fantastic study where you assembled something like thousands of scientists and I think over 100,000 patients, and did a 20-year longitudinal study. I think it was in 2017 Lancet, and published it on the effects of alcohol over time. And the headline of that study was, alcohol in any amount is toxic to the human system. It's a really dangerous drug. And by the way, as an aside, there's a great book called Drink by a guy named Gatley. And in it, he discusses the fact that England was drunk for 100 years. When alcohol was really discovered, everybody thought it was the greatest thing since chopped liver. And evidently everybody from the poorest person to the king was drunk for that whole period. And there's a famous story about when Benjamin Franklin, as a young man, went to England to buy some materials for a printing press because he was a printer. He found that the people were drinking alcohol for breakfast, lunch, and dinner because the water wasn't trustworthy. So they were drinking beer for breakfast. So he looked around, he realized they made like a porridge out of the beer material, and they had that. So they were basically having alcohol for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They were besotted all the time. And what Franklin did was he never drank, and he saved that beer money as a way to get back to the United States because he was totally broke. He'd been tricked. It's a cute story. But anyway, getting back to marijuana, so it's dramatically safer as a recreational high than alcohol. That has been clearly proven. And it has similar effects, not the same effect as alcohol, of course, but similar enough that I think there's a lot of room for alcohol to become the modern day, I erased that, for marijuana to become the modern day alcohol. Much safer to the system. We're not going to have cirrhosis of the liver, effects on high blood pressure, and so on. Is it without, any problems? No, nothing's without any problems. So I don't want to state it that way, and I do want to say more research. But everything I've read and learned in the last 50 years about marijuana is when you compare it to alcohol, it is definitely the drug of choice if the public needs a recreational, mind-altering substance that's benign and relatively safe. That doesn't mean I'm advocating driving automobiles or doing anything that requires visual motor dexterity with marijuana. That's another whole story, but that's true of alcohol as well.
I think broadly, I agree that cannabis probably is safer than alcohol. But I think the important caveat of the link to psychosis does need to be mentioned, that for a minority of people who have like family history of psychosis or previous history, or perhaps a genetic predisposition, from the research that I think papers that have been published by King's, actually epidemiological studies seem to indicate that there's quite a strong and consistent link between cannabis and psychosis.
I haven't seen studies that convince me of that, but I'm open and I'd love to read them. Particularly when you dive into the study with regard to volume, because there is no question that the effect of marijuana is dose related, as it is with so many medicines.
Yes, in fact, the study I'm referring to showed there's a correlation between the THC content and the risk of psychosis. And of course, THC content over the past few decades has increased quite remarkably. It used to be, I think, something like less than 5% THC, and now you can easily get THC content of like 12% and higher in some cases.
Yes, that's true, and you can buy it. Of course, when you ingest it, you can take in much greater amounts. There's no question but that as you take more and more marijuana at one setting, the effect gets greater and greater. The psychological effect increases dramatically. And I've stated, and I believe, that if you take enough of it for your particular system, it becomes a psychedelic. It's a psychedelic experience, and it can last for hours. Now, how that phenomenon relates to people who are predisposed to mental, what we might call instability, is a very important question. I would love to see the study. If you'd send me a link for that study that you're referencing, I'd love to read that. But that is the key issue, right? Dosage as related to the pre-existing condition of the person. I can also tell you, a patient of mine came in on a Monday morning and said he was my most unstable, most close to, pre-existing for psychosis, came in on a Monday morning and said, I took 2,000 micrograms of LSD over the weekend. Please tell me what the big whoop is. I didn't find anything happen whatsoever, so I went about my business. That was an interesting, odd case, but I just thought I'd tell you about it because such things also happen. So anyway, we go back to the issue about marijuana. I don't know if I've answered all of your questions about it. The other good thing about marijuana in terms of goodness is that, it really shouldn't cost any more than broccoli. It's just a vegetable that comes out of the ground. There's nothing, doesn't require a lot. And so if people were really interested in it, they could grow it, and everyone could grow it in their own backyard or in their house and not have to pay for it. And that's a particular interest of mine because I'm concerned that psychedelics could be an upper class or an upper middle class phenomenon. It depends on the price and how they're presented to the public. And if they're really going to be medicines, then they really need to be equal opportunity medicines. I don't favor medicines that only a certain economic class can purchase. And because I know that there have been some sprays, psilocybin sprays available, and they were like $600 for a small bottle and so on. And that's, once again, people capitalizing on this renaissance that's going on, and so that's something for our profession to keep an eye on, because in addition to being health practitioners, we've got to be a bit of a politician at the same time if we're going to protect our patients, in other ways.
I suppose it's difficult where there's private healthcare. There is that element of being able to pay for a certain thing. I think that there's the issue with that in the UK, present with cannabis, medicinal cannabis. I don't think many practitioners would prescribe it on the NHS.
Yes. The first cases of the government allowing it in this country were about 30 or 40 years ago, I think, for glaucoma. The government made a drug called Marinol, which, if you're not familiar with it, you know that word, Marinol, you might check it out. Taking marijuana for glaucoma because it dries out the vitreous humor. And that was the reason the government approved it and came up with this medicine that they got Big Pharma to build that hardly anybody could buy, called Marinol, Marinol. Well, it didn't go anywhere. You never heard much about it. But nowadays, here in the States, you can buy a bottle that looks like a regular medicine bottle, and it has little capsules in it that look like medicine capsules, and they contain various amounts of tetrahydrocannabinol, 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams, and 25 milligram pills.
I remember always seeing that as the excuse that people would take, that people would justify the marijuana prescription with having glaucoma. It was kind of like a running joke in pop culture when I was growing up.
Everybody's got glaucoma. Yeah.
The last drug that I wanted to ask you about was ketamine. I wanted to ask, what's your experience with ketamine? Have you interviewed people who've used it, and what are your thoughts on its medicinal uses?
First of all, let me say that I've personally experienced every one of these medicines that we're talking about. And some of them I've experienced over decades, both professionally and when they were legal, personally and professionally. And I've always used them as medicinals, rarely, but not never, but rarely recreationally. I consider them, some of them for sure, to be almost sacramental, because when you take something that takes you into a whole different universe, that there's something sacramental. It's looking at a new way of seeing the world, and a large LSD experience will do that, and an ayahuasca experience will do that, and a psilocybin experience will do that. It will take you into a whole different way of seeing yourself and seeing the world, and it'll open up a realization that the reality that we live in is not the only reality, it's just one of many realities. MDMA won't necessarily do that. Well, MDMA is different. It brings down defenses. It makes one feel more soft, empathetic, and heartful. It's a fantastic medicine for doing couples therapy. But it's not technically psychedelic, and unless you view seeing the world more heartfully as a reality shift, it really isn't a reality shift. It's more within this reality of being more empathetic and being more heartful. And I highly recommend it to couples when they can get a good therapist to work with them, because in the work that I was able to do with MDMA, the couples almost universally reported that they got to material that they'd never gotten to in psychotherapy and couples work. They wondered if they ever would have gotten to it. They considered it huge breakthroughs, and usually positive, almost to the person, but not every person. There have been problems. There have been some problems reported, and I've seen problems with MDMA as well. You can't be sure it's the MDMA or what the cause was.
Like what? Sorry, what problems?
Oh, I witnessed a doctor. I wasn't the guide, someone else was, but I was a welcome in on the maybe as a backup guide, you might say. And I saw a psychologist take MDMA and have a major paranoid experience.
Okay.
Yeah, got really scared, negative thinking, dark and so on. But fortunately, she was with me, and I view what are called bummers or bad experiences. I view them as the best experiences, because they're the opportunity to get into the stuff that you're most afraid of and deal with it and conquer it and come out feeling a sense of mastery, rather than always knowing that it's in some sealed off compartment in the recesses of the consciousness and could come out at any time and do its dirty work. In a bad experience, you have the whole darn thing right out in front of you doing its dirty work, and you can look at it together with the guide, get right into it and conquer it. So that's why I see what's called a bad experience as a good experience, because I view these medicinals as facilitators of the work.
Similar to psychotherapy itself, I suppose, because psychotherapy is hard work. Many sessions are difficult and draining for the client. But the point is, as you say, to get into that difficult material, because ultimately, like, I think one of the lessons of psychotherapy is you don't get to bypass difficult stuff psychologically or elsewhere. You really have to, the obstacle is the way. You really have to go through it in order to make some meaning out of it and ultimately to improve your perspective. And I think it's a similar principle with psychedelics.
It is. And that's why it's critical that the guide be experienced. Because if the guide gets scared, when the patient gets scared, then you got real trouble. And they're both scared. And then that negative stuff doesn't turn into positive stuff. It just remains negative, and the whole takeaway is we had a terrible negative experience together, which is what you don't want. But I agree with what you just said. Psychotherapy is work. It's not a walk in the park. It's work. It can be fun work if you like improving yourself. But it's hard work, for sure.
It's interesting you mentioned group therapy, because I know we've only just got to phase 3 trials of MDMA for psychotherapy for PTSD. And it will probably take quite a long time for us to get to trials for group therapy, but hopefully with time we will get there because of the promising results that we've already had.
What's the situation with MDMA use as a medicine in England?
As far as I'm aware, I don't think they're that dissimilar to the US in terms of there's just that first clinical trial, the phase 3 clinical trial by MAPS. I'm not aware of any other trials ongoing at the moment, but I could be wrong. I don't know if you know anything else, Alex.
It's being studied, I believe it's being studied for alcoholism.
Okay. That's interesting. How?
Yeah, you all did some great work on alcoholism with LSD while it was still legal.
Was that back in the 50s and 60s?
Yeah, that's correct. Before the United States went on a worldwide tour to stop research around the world and got your country to go along with the evil words of the head of the Federal Narcotics Bureau here, called Harry Anslinger, who was a one man wrecking ball against science.
One of the drugs that the UK is moving forward with is ketamine, which brings me back to my question of what's your experience, Dr. Miller, with ketamine and with people that you've spoken to about ketamine?
Okay, to begin with, let's look. Marijuana is basically a muscle relaxant. That's what it basically does. LSD is a psychedelic. Psilocybin is a psychedelic. It brings on psychedelic realities. Ketamine is anesthesia. That's its basic use. It's an anesthesia. It's not an expander. It's not a consciousness expander. It's an anesthesia. So you're dealing with something that's putting you in an anesthetized state. And within that anesthetized state, it has certain medicinal properties that have been found to be amenable in certain doses, underlined in red, in certain doses amenable to facilitating certain aspects of psychotherapy. My opinion is that the reason ketamine is getting the play that it's getting is that because it's an anesthesia and was used as an anesthesia, it's the only legal, quote, psychedelic. So being the only legal, it's getting play, because if all you have is one ball to play with, you're going to play with that ball. Now, is it the best of all the balls in the gym? I don't think so. But if you only have one, that's the one you play with. So we have some great people doing ketamine therapy in this country. In fact, I can tell you about one institute that I'm loosely affiliated with called the SAGE Institute, run by two lovely doctors, Genesee Herzberg and Jason Butler. By the way, the three of us have a book coming out soon together called Psychedelic Psychotherapy. Get a little plug for that. And and they have been very ingenious in working out ways to do what you might call pandemic ketamine therapy. The patient comes in, gets their lozenge of ketamine, goes home, goes on the Zoom the way the three of us are on it now. They've got the doctor on the other side of their Zoom. They ingest the ketamine lozenge, and they have a psychotherapy session. And the therapist stays with them until they're off it enough for them to be able to go on their own way. So that's a very ingenious tactic, modality, you know.
A sign of the times.
A sign of the times, yes. Zoom psychedelic therapy with ketamine. Now, would you want to do the same thing with LSD and ayahuasca? I'd have to think about that for a couple of months before I'd answer that question. Well, with regard to ketamine, which in small doses is so mild, I think they're safe, and there haven't been any reports of problems.
Can ketamine take you to another world, like you mentioned that LSD can, but MDMA can't?
Well, a good question. It depends on the method of ingestion, of administration, and the dose. You can take ketamine by having it injected into your veins, IV. You can take it into the muscles IM, and you can take a lozenge and swallow it, and you can take the powder and inhale it. So there are 4 different ways for sure of taking it. And of course, the IV is the most powerful. When you take it IV at certain doses, it's definitely psychedelic. In fact, it's so powerful that one doesn't want to do anything but stay horizontal.
Okay.
So on the one extreme, you'd say IV, and you're horizontal. On the other extreme, you'd say a lozenge, and you sit at your computer and talk to your therapist. And then there's everything in between. The intranasal administration is totally dose related. Of course, the lozenges are too. You could eat a bunch of them, but that you'd be going beyond the prescription. When you get to beyond verbal with the ketamine, then it becomes more of an LSD, psilocybin, or ayahuasca experience, because you're basically going to be with your eyes closed and looking inside. My own experience with it and my research on it is that in those large doses, once again, the ability to bring back is extremely difficult. The ride is extremely enjoyable if you're up for that kind of ride. But you have to be the kind of person who enjoys really exotic internal experiences. And when I say really exotic, I'll give you an example. 3 people take a large enough dose, IM or IV, of ketamine. They're horizontal to begin with. They're not going to stand up and walk around. They're going to stay horizontal. They're going to lose a sense of the differentiation between their bodies and the people who are next to them. So if the 3 of them are sitting on a couch together, they are going to literally lose a sense of where their body begins and the other person's body begins. There's going to be a merging as if the 3 of them are one large organism. For some people, it can be extremely scary. You've got to be either an experienced psychedelic voyager, or you've got to have a very experienced guide if you're going to use ketamine in that large way.
That sounds quite scary.
But of course, that's true for LSD and psilocybin and ayahuasca, very true at the same time. It's not that the ketamine will get you to places that are scarier than the others. It's just different. Also, the internal material that you see on those large doses are kaleidoscopes, visions, could be anything from the pyramids to cosmic space, and again, can be anything from incredibly enjoyable to, depending on your mental state, quite scary to be seeing things move so quickly, a sense of loss of control. There's no control whatsoever. You have to either learn how to go with it and have the guide tell you how to flow with it, because if you try to block it or stop it, you're going to have anxiety and you're going to panic. And that's not good.
Can that anxiety and panic and traumatic experience be prolonged for long term after the experience? For example, could you develop PTSD from something that you've experienced from taking a psychedelic?
Only if the guide wasn't experienced enough to turn whatever you're feeling into a positive experience, so you come away with a sense of new confidence, so that if anything like this should ever happen in real daily life, I know how to deal with it, because I've already dealt with such scary stuff. I know just what to do. I've got tools in my tool bag. But if the guide doesn't give you some tools to use, sure, you're out there alone, and then you come off the stuff, you could come out with a feeling of, oh my God, I'm never going to do that again, and I don't want any flashbacks about what happened. And if I do get flashbacks, I better get some help, because they're going to scare the bejeebers out of me.
And that emphasizes why it's so important to not take these drugs recreationally, just on a whim when you don't know what you're taking.
That is critical. I mean, we're talking about very serious material here where micrograms, something you can't even see, can send you into cosmic hyperspace, either in a great way or possibly a terrible way. So, the key word, if there's one key word for these psychedelic medicinals, it's respect. Huge amount of respect. And how these folks, drop acid and go to these events, raves and so on, is way beyond that's way beyond my experience. Because the other thing that happens with psychedelics is our sensitivities are greatly enhanced. Colors are magnified, but so are sounds and so are vibrations. And that's why it's imperative when taking these psychedelic medicines to be in a ultra safe, quiet setting. You do not want to be around a jackhammer or moving cars or industrial noise, which keeps a vibration coming at your tympanic membrane for the whole time. It'll be magnified. Even something like the furnace in your own home could sound like a roaring river. So I tell people, you don't do it in your own home. When you do these psychedelics, you need a very specially created place, or your doctor or guide has a special place, or you're out in the country, or possibly on a beach with the guide, safe, right? Ultra quiet, ultra low decibel levels, so that you can have the experience inside yourself without stuff coming at you that you have to put up a shield or do something about. People forget that when we put up a shield to block out ambient sound, that shield costs us. That's an energy shield that our system has to put up. And that energy, that costs. It has to come from somewhere. It's not free. That's real important.
No, for sure.
Yes.
Do you think it's possible to get to this level of another world that you explain without taking psychedelic medicine? Can we do it through breathing or yoga? Is that something you've experienced?
I want to believe that there are people who have spent so much time, maybe in ashrams or monasteries, looking within, that they're able to achieve this au naturel. But I haven't met any. And and the other thing is, I have met with high-ranking people in the church and discussed this very topic. And they're talking to me because they're thinking that the psychedelics can facilitate seminarians getting to places that'll take them 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, if ever, to get to in the monasteries. And maybe with these psychedelics, they could get there in days, weeks, or months, particularly MDMA and LSD they're inquiring about. So I think I answered your question. Everything is theoretically possible, of course. I think another way of looking at your question is something that I think one of your country people, the Countess Amanda Fielding, did some interesting work with, she told me about, was when she took LSD 90 days in a row, many decades ago. What she was trying to achieve, and I personally have done the same thing, but not to the Olympic level of Amanda, but she was trying to achieve getting so used to the psychedelic state that when she stopped, she would still be in it. Mm-hmm. In other words, her takeaway would be total. She would walk around in the world. It wasn't a very high dose, by the way. Mm-hmm. I think she took 100 micrograms every day for 90 days. Okay. If you run into her, tell her we had this conversation and ask her. She'll tell you about it. Do you know her?
Yeah, I've read a lot about her for our interviews. Yeah. And she's in your book as well. But I don't know her personally, no.
Oh, you should invite her over to Maudsley and have her give a little talk and get to know her.
I'd
She's a
love to.
wonderful. Oh yeah, invite her over. She'll come. She's a wonderful person, and you want to learn about the Hefter Institute that she started and so on, for sure. Yeah, I mean, you've got an Olympian there in London, in England.
But did it work? Did the LSD every day work? Did she reach a state?
Yeah, you have to ask her that. I'm not gonna stick my neck out on that one. But I'll tell you from my own experience, it's. I believe the work has helped me become a better person, and by a better person I mean I was already in this field, and this, if you're in this health profession, you're a helping person. So I was already a helping person to begin with, but I do believe it's enhanced my empathy and my serenity. Those two things for sure, unquestionably. Now, there's another issue, which is, and this is related to Amanda, you can talk to her about it. She believes that the LSD has a particular oxygenating effect on the brain. And we do know that oxygenating various parts of the system is a very powerful medicinal. We know that oxygen kills germs, and we do know that oxygen in the blood system can kill cancer, traveling cancer, as it may have in mind. It's called creating oxidative stress on the cancer cells. And so when you look at the slides of the brain on LSD and the brain without LSD that Amanda published and was printed on the front page, I believe, of the New York Times, there are indications that the LSD is highly oxygenating the brain. And so that is a clue. And that's all it is. We need a lot more research on that. And it's going to be some very exciting research on the relationship between LSD and oxygenation of brain tissue. I look forward to that.
I think one thing worth pointing out in relation to your question, Rebecca, you asked, can you kind of achieve these similar states of consciousness sober? And I think, like Dr. Miller said, you're not going to achieve the intensity, or it's very difficult at least to achieve that kind of intensity sober. However, a lot of the benefits that you would get from psychedelics, like a change in worldview, a change in how you see yourself, improved empathy and compassion, and particularly, Dr. Miller, I like that you mentioned serenity. And to me, serenity is something like, it's a lot of things, but it's something like your willingness to surrender to reality as it is. I think all of those things you can definitely achieve sober through. I have very limited experience with meditation. We're talking about a few hundred hours, so quite novice. But even with my experience, I feel like all of those different properties very much achievable with some kind of sound spiritual practice. I think what's interesting, though, Sam Harris talks about this quite a lot. I don't know if you're familiar with Sam Harris, Dr. Miller. He's quite an advocate of psychedelics.
Oh, I know Sam Harris. I think I interviewed him on my radio program.
For people who maybe aren't naturally inclined to meditate, maybe aren't spiritually inclined, maybe they find the practice counterintuitive, psychedelics can be a useful catalyst to give them a kind of breakthrough experience, to give them a taste of what it could be like to experience a different state of consciousness, so that then when they do start some kind of spiritual practice, they have an idea of where they're going. Because I do think the spiritual practice and psychedelics, although they have different intensities, they're pointing at something similar. One thing I'm curious about, Dr. Miller, when you said, psychedelics have this power to change worldview and to change the way you see yourself, what do you think specifically for you? What do you think changed about you post-psychedelics?
Pre-psychedelics, existential responsibility was an intellectual understanding. After my first psychedelic experience, existential responsibility became an emotional, and if you want to use the word spiritual, I don't understand that word, so I'm not sure how to use it, but it became beyond cognitive processing. So I might call it emotional, or what Heinlein called grokking. If you remember Heinlein in Stranger in a Strange Land, and if you don't, you ought to read it as soon as possible. But he talks, when you grok something is when you understand it at a level that's beyond emotion and beyond thinking, but you know it's you because it's the core you, and it's the core me that lives in this thing that we call a body, that I call my transporter. Because this body is not me. I can cut a foot off or a leg or an arm, and I still exist. You can cut off a lot of me and I still exist. And so part of that is a way of me understanding that isn't me. That's the stuff that carries me around, right? And psychedelics definitely put me in touch with that greater me, that what Heinlein called the sense that groks. And it was in that experience that what I call existential responsibility went from being a cognitive process to a grokking or an emotional process. Namely, I had an immediate, dramatic recognition that every person on the planet is connected. That's what I mean by existential responsibility. They were all connected. In fact, I saw it as a vision. I saw the planet and I saw the people on the planet connected by electrobiochemical magnetic waves. So that was like, it was almost like a hairnet of humans. And with that came the immediate recognition that the planet itself is a living, breathing organism, and everything on it, us, plants, trees, rocks, etc., are all nothing more or nothing less than parts of this living, breathing organism. And that realization changed my life. There was, at that moment, what happened to me, I was 20, in my late 20s, 27, 28. After that, there was no other. There was no such a thing as other. It's all us. And of course, with that came a lot of difficulty and pain when I focus on it, because I have to recognize that part of us is going around the world killing us. In the same way, on the micro level, we get cancer that kills an individual. We are cancer spreading when we go declare war on a country and bomb a whole bunch of people. We're killing ourselves. We're not killing them, which is what we get sold as an army in a country. We're going to go kill them. We're going to go get them, those bad guys that look funny and all that. We're basically, the recognition came at that time in my 20s that we're killing ourselves off. We could just as well be walking around the block and taking a big machete and just slicing off an arm, throwing it away. So I hope I answered your question.
So it's kind of like you're integrating your shadow in a big way, all the possibility for your own or the species aggression, capacity for evil, things like that. And I suppose the thing about the existential responsibility as well is that once you have it, you have this realization that what you do is important and matters. And you can't really be carefree anymore once you're at that point. You have now, life is a series of choices and you need to think about them carefully because you're conscious of your effect on other people.
And every single act has an effect. Exactly. I agree with you. Exactly how you stated it. And you can never tell when taking the time to consider and doing a particular act might have a positive ripple effect that could go places. You have no way of measuring that. But what you said, though, about the dark is also part of the realization, because if we're capable of killing ourselves with a cancer or killing other people with knives or guns or whatever we use, munitions, and doing horrendous things, that says to me, and it said to me when I had the realization, that every one of us has this dark part inside of us. It's not like just Hitler and 5 other guys around the planet. You know, we all have it. And then we all have the other stuff. And it's up to us to determine how we're going to live on this big ball of earth, this Gaia.
Dr. Miller, you've mentioned a number of books that you'd recommend we read. What else would you recommend for our listeners who want to learn more about psychedelic medicine?
I love Sidney Girard's book, The Transparent Self. I don't know if I mentioned that last time, but I think that's an important book.
What's it about?
It's about radical transparency, and it was written 50 years ago. It's about the importance of being open and honest with each other, and it's about how secrets are kept to have power over people. There's nothing inherently positive about a secret. It's about what might be referred to nowadays as open source. Let everybody know everything. There's nothing to be afraid of if you let everybody know everything. Jim Fadiman's book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, is a must to have in your library. Michael Pollan's book is worth having because it's on the, he's a great writer and it's a personal experience. I think my book, if you have my book, Psychedelic Medicine, Fadiman's book, and Pollan's book, yeah, then you get all three. See, in my book, you get the scientists. In Fadiman's book, you get the recipes, how to do it. And in Pollan's book, you get the personal experience of what it was like. You pretty much got the field covered with those 3 books, right? And then if you want to get into microdosing, you might read Ayelet Waldman's book, A Really Good Day. And that's a personal experience also about microdosing in a careful way with a guide. So then you'd have 4, and that would, that'll really cover your bases. Of course, the book that got me into it all over 50 years ago was the Tibetan Book of the Dead, written by Leary and Alpert. Because as I might have mentioned, I don't recall in the first program, if it was after reading that book that I went out and got 400 morning glory seeds and ate them. Yeah, I told you that. But there's a will, there's a way.
You did. Do you have any advice for me and Alex as training psychiatrists and working psychiatrists for the future?
Are you both training psychiatrists at Maudsley?
Alex is a senior,
You're a senior
training psychiatrist.
Well, first of all, advice is to be grateful because you're in a great place with a great historic tradition. I mean, isn't Maudsley where Ronnie Lang used to hang out at one time? And I knew Ronnie Lang. I want you to know that. I've had some great talks with Ronnie Lang when he was still around. And I think his another book, everybody's got to read Knots, Knots by Ronnie Lang. That's a must read, of course. And I hope everybody at Maudsley reads it. It should be the Bible for Maudsley.
You'd be surprised what people read and don't read at the Maudsley.
So to begin with, advice to you two is that you can be so grateful for being at such a wonderful place to begin
Absolutely.
with. And
yeah, I feel grateful doing my job. I love it. I feel so grateful every day.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a wonderful thing in this world. And that's why at 82, I'm still practicing because I love the work. I think it's one of the greatest jobs on the planet. You get to be nosy and help people at the same time. You get to ask all the toughest questions and the interesting questions, and you do so in a way that helps people's lives. What a great thing. And then you end up getting paid for it in addition. Really.
Yeah, I agree. And I was thinking about it the other day, and I had just done some therapy sessions. And I remember thinking what I really enjoy about it is, in contrast to so many conversations and interactions you have with people, it's very, very real. There's no small talk. There's no air of politeness or beating around the bush. You're having a very real conversation about very real problems. And even though it's hard and not always pleasant, there's something profoundly calming about it that's difficult to put into words. And one question I love asking, because I hope you're okay for time, by the way, but one question I love asking, because I always get a different answer from therapists and psychologists, is what for you is the essence of good psychotherapy or good counseling?
The alliance. The essence of good therapy is the alliance. The therapist's ability to connect with that other person that they call a patient or a client, but that other human being sitting in the room with them, the therapist's ability to connect with them at a cognitive, emotional, biochemical, electrical way so that that person feels the connection. And when that person feels the connection, it will help them open up to possibilities that the therapist might provide as options to their way, their habitual way of living. And it'll open them up to listening to these options as creative possibilities for them, rather than to be defensive and push them away or forget them. So it's that alliance. To me, that is the essence. That alliance changes the picture from two people sitting together working on a project to two people collaborating to the benefit of one of them. Not that the therapist doesn't benefit from doing that good work, but the purpose of being there is to collaborate for the benefit of the patient. So the alliance allows that collaborative effort to be as deep as it can.
You are listening to the Thinking Mind podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend or give us a rating. It really does help people to find us. If you find the podcast valuable, why not buy us a coffee to help keep us going? There's a link in the show notes. As ever, we love to hear from you and love to hear what you think. So drop us an email or get in touch on social media. Thank you so much.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the interview with Dr. Miller. If you haven't already, go give part 1 of the interview with Dr. Miller a listen. It's interview number 26.